Greetings and good afternoon, and welcome to the first episode of the PLP Pathways webinar series. This is our fifth season, and we're very happy to be back on the air talking about all things Act 77, equity, and how to build really positive relationships with students. My name is Don Taylor. I teach language arts and social studies at Main Street Middle School in Montpelier, and I'm joined by other contributors who make this work a dynamic and educator-focused exercise. And I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi there, I'm Meg O'Donnell. I teach on the RED team. It's a 7-8 team at Chadbourne Community School. It's one of two 7-8 teams, and I'm happy to be here.
I'm Kevin Peely-Hunt. I teach on Swift House at Wilson Central School.
And before we go too much further, we'd like to thank the Middle Grades Institute and the Middle Grades Collaborative for sponsoring this work. We're also supported by the Tarrant Institute for Innovative Education in Vermont. And a big thanks out there and congratulations to all the educators in Vermont who have successfully kicked off the 2019-2020 school year. So today we're going to be discussing the nuts and bolts of starting the year building student relationships. And the essential question is, how can our understanding of educational equity shape our knowledge of the three pillars of personalized learning and student efficacy? And how are we creating equitable, innovative curriculum that's relevant, rigorous, and supports all of our students? One of the things that you're going to see this year, if you're tuning into our webinar, is the integration of issues of equity into our work. And I'll speak for myself. I'm not an expert on this. I'm learning as I'm going, and I'm trying to do the best that I can to make sure that we provide an equitable learning opportunities to all students. One of the documents that we'll be referring to across the course of the year is Paul Gorski's Equity Literacy Framework. And that equity literacy framework identifies equity literacy as preparing us to recognize even the subtlest ways that access and opportunity are distributed unfairly across race, class, gender, identity, sexual orientation, ability, language, and other factors. By recognizing these inequities, by responding to them, by redressing them, and by creating and sustaining a bias-free and equitable classroom, we hope to create cultures in schools that are supporting our kids as they enter adulthood and facing the challenges of the 21st century. I also do want to mention that this year, we're also going to be providing professional development hours for those people who want to tune into our webinars. You can watch it, and PLP Pathways will be sending out modules. You can watch the video, complete a few questions, and get certified for a professional development hour. Again, it's a sort of the second year of our pilot doing micro-credentialing so that we can provide professional development for the time spent learning about these issues. Today's words of the webinar, as you heard me mention, are identity, relationships, and equity. And again, the focus today is really how are we building strong relationships with kids in an equitable way, and how are we working with identity? To talk more about that is Kevin, and Kevin's going to get us going on the identity, relationships, and equity piece.
Yeah, so one thing we'd love to start with is the personal learning framework, which is, we're chunking out the year into three bigger pieces. We have identity, which is where we're at right now and kind of where we're going to be sitting for a little bit longer in the beginning of the school year. And that's, as Don mentioned, developing those relationships with the kids. And then we're going to be moving into the growth and reflection phase and finishing up with the transformation phase. So within that identity phase in the personal learning framework, we're really helping kids to figure out who they are, both just as individuals and as learners, how they fit in their community, what types of principles and values they hold on to, and what some of their goals are as well. So a couple of things that I know that we had talked about is, how do we develop those relationships? And one thing that we have a resource with is Mary Sullivan talks quite a bit about building positive relationships with students and why it's so important. And she mentions, that, and this kind of dovetails with the idea of personalized learning too, at middle school, especially this like 5 through 8 grade, at this point in their lives, we have these kids who they're really wanting independence, but at the same time, they're still needing some of those structures, and they really need to feel loved and feel connected and feel safe. And it's like, how are we finding that balance with that? And building those positive relationships with kids early immediately gives them that sense of belonging. And we won't be able to access anything else with these kids unless they have that sense of belonging, unless they have that sense of trust. And, that and all else, like, it's just great to get to know these kids inside and out and just know who they are as people and what they're bringing. It's, it's our family throughout the school year. When you think about it, there are kids for the school year, and it's a neat opportunity for us to get to have a relationship with so many different people and do that in many different ways.
So Kevin, I just want to mention one thing too for our listeners out there. We have a pretty vibrant YouTube channel, and we're posting lots of information and lots of short videos. So Kevin mentioned there's a great video up there from Dr. Mary Sullivan about relationships. There's also a really great video from the 2019 Middle Grades Institute and Dr. Dave Brown, who talks about adolescent identity in relation to Act 77. And those are short 5 to 7 minute videos, and they really dial in on this idea of relationships on identity. Meg?
Yeah, I've just been reflecting, Don, as I'm listening to Kev talk about it, just starting a brand new middle school structure essentially at our school, and trying to think about ways that we've been trying to build those relationships when over half of the students are brand new to me. So all of us, all teachers here at Chadbourne Community School, 7-8 teachers we've got some familiar faces, but we've got some brand new kids that we haven't seen. And I think the power of, as challenging as it is to start a new system or a new team, what's interesting is the opportunity for all of us to have this kind of fresh start. And something I love about the beginning of the year is seeing that growth that happens for kids from 7th grade to 8th grade or 6th grade to 7th grade. And they get a fresh start. There's some kids that had some real significant challenges at the end of last year and are coming in ready to say, this is a new beginning for me, because it's a new beginning for all of us. So we sort of all have this interesting opportunity to reset, and that's been really powerful to see how kids are. It's been a fairly calm beginning to the year because we're all new. It's all, there's new routines and there's new systems, and having that chance to just say, wow, I'm in 8th grade. I'm the oldest one in the school here. I want to kind of make this one count. And so it's been powerful to sort of see some kids try on being a different person than who they were when they left at the end of 7th grade.
And Meg, do you think that has, I know that you said you've created a new team, is that correct?
Yeah.
Do you think it has, how much of that new team identity are you linking that to the kids getting a fresh start, or how much do you think is just at their age and their maturity from 7th to 8th grade?
I think it's got to be a combination of all of it, right? Like, I don't think it's just, I think for some of them, it's definitely about a maybe new set of teachers. It's a different peer group. They're mixed up with peers that may or may not have been the most positive combination of kids. And so that it's that opportunity to reset. And again, I think because all of us are in it, it wasn't just like one team had to switch, but, and I'm not proposing this by any stretch as a means of transformation, but I think it's giving kids and teachers a new beginning. And it's a combination of however they matured over the summer, the reality of where they sit in their school year, and whether it's 8th grade or the beginning of 7th grade. And I think it's fostering new friendships with new peers and other kids on the team. It's an interesting place to sit with this, identity piece. it's just been
And just one more follow-up question, Meg. How often are you thinking about these relationships and this identity? So with a new team and new teachers and new kids, how explicit are you being about the creation of relationships, both in your teaching lessons and maybe also in your language?
Yeah. Gosh, that's a good question, Don. I would say, daily. I mean, part of the curriculum work that we're doing is around identity and understanding a sense of place through the town of Shelburne, and looking at the story of place. And so as we're looking at stories, we're looking at our identity, and having kids kind of recognize whose voices become dominant in a place and whose voices become more marginalized. And then I think we've maintained this multi-age prime group component. So I have a prime group of 20 kids that are 7th and 8th graders. And that's sort of like my homeroom or my core, however you want to call it. And that gives me a chance to meet. I get their Friday emails. I get to connect with those students and their families. So that gives me a window into who this, 20 of the 80, I get to have kind of a different connection with than just kids coming through my class. I don't know if that helps, but
yeah, and I'd like to come back to that in a little bit, particularly about this idea of the community and identity, and also these marginalized voices. But before I do that, Kevin is in a very different situation where his team is not new. They have a lot of traditions, and I'm just wondering if Kevin can talk about how, maintaining some stability, perhaps over a long term. How does that, where Meg is reflecting on these new relationships and these new structures, and it's, everybody's going through it. Kevin, how does creating some stability or having these traditions and, kids being familiar with the program, how do you think that benefits or maybe sometimes hinders relationships?
Yeah, for sure. I think we're so fortunate that we have a multi-age team, that we have these kids from 5th through 8th grade, because it makes a world of difference to be able to develop those relationships over those 4 years. And I haven't really seen an instant where I'd say it hinders the relationship building process. I think partly because we have 4 core teachers on our team, and at the end of every year we allow students to write a letter to us where they describe themselves as a person and talk about, reflect on their year, and then they can write who they want as next year's core teacher and why they connect with that teacher, and who they want as friends in their core. And then we look at all those letters, and that's how we do our core placements. So say if a student, isn't feeling super connected to that one core teacher, but they feel connected to one of the other teachers in Swift House, they have the opportunity to then develop, more deeply develop that relationship with that teacher. So I don't think we've ever had an instance where we're like, oh, this is harder because we're more familiar with these kids and families. On the flip side, it being positive, like you were saying, at this point, we're kind of in the middle of and close to wrapping up some of our goal setting conferences for our 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And they've just been wonderful because, these kids come in there before or after school with their parents, and we sit down and just hear from them about, how did they end the year last year with their goals? What are their thoughts about changing any of their goals if they want to? And getting them to reflect on, again, how have they grown as a learner? What kind of things are they interested in now, or what kind of things would they like to be reflecting on a weekly basis? And then we just, touch base about how's the start of the school year going. And it's just the level of comfort we see, especially I see it a lot with the 6th graders, because that first conference that we have with the 5th graders can be really awkward when they're new to Swift. And by the time we have that first conference the following year when they're 6th graders, they're very comfortable. The family knows you. And then by the time our 8th grade families come in, we're shooting the breeze with them. They feel like, we've known them for 4 years now, and we really know the kids. We really know the parents. So it's really cool to be able to kind of get into, that goal setting process. And it always comes back to having the kid, the student's voice be heard. And I think, from day one of our Hopes and Dreams conferences with our 5th graders, parents see that as something we value on our team, and that sets the year off, sets the 4 years off on that foot of that's something like we're committed to hearing your kid's voice and listening to them. And I think that really helps them to feel trusted and that, you know, we care about them.
There's a lot there. And one of the things, you know, we've talked about equity and we've talked about integrating equity. And one of the things that you're talking quite a bit about is this family communications and building relationships, not only between the teachers and the students, but also between the school or the team and the teachers and the families. And I think that's, you know, critical, right? Especially for students who may not feel that sense of belonging right away. But the other piece that I think is important too is, you know, personalization or some of the things that you're having them do. Meg is having them, you know, the story of place. And, you know, to me, I always want to remind folks that those stories of places, that can be where you're doing like academic literary analysis, right? You're implementing the skills that students need, but you're doing it in a way that's engaging and that's relevant to them. And that ties in some way to their sense of self and their sense of place. And the other thing that we talked about was, you know, this family communication or writing these letters, right? Again, those can all be standards-based writing pieces, but they're important to the kids and they're engaging to the kids. And that's where I think proficiencies really come in. We'll talk about proficiencies later, but having those proficiencies allows kids or allows you as the educator to focus on some of these identity pieces in a way that's really meaningful. And I think that's really important, you know, to think about. And I deeply appreciate the work that you do with the families. I think that, that's critical. And I think that's a big sort of equity piece. Meg, I want to go back to you. Do you have yeah, go ahead.
Just really quick. I'm so sorry, but
no.
One thing that's really stood out for me is when you do lose those multi-year relationships, how much time, and maybe this is a question or I'm not sure, but that idea of student reflection, how much we took that for granted because we had these repeated relationships or these repeated systems where kids were really were that their reflection mattered to them in a way. Do you know what I mean? Because you've got those hopes and dreams conferences, that's such an important skill. And I'm realizing that without that being a system-wide part of a student's experience, it's harder for them to really feel safe or comfortable to be honest about reflection. And I think that's something, Kev, that in your systems and in your starting with the hopes and dreams and having those partners and hearing their voices being heard regularly, that capacity for kids to dive into and reflect on their practice and like, here's what I'm doing pretty well, here's what I need to work on. Because I've been doing this for 3 or 4 years, it's a no-brainer. You know, it's not, it doesn't feel vulnerable. And it's something I'm becoming keenly aware of. It's a system that I have to rebuild, I guess is what I'm saying. Like we're talking about it as teachers, like, boy, we really need to put this in place on a regular basis and model for them what it means to reflect on who I am. Because that's the only way I can figure where I feel safe to be able to take risks or identify goals.
And Meg, one thing you just said about the reflection piece is, you know, you can have kids write some reflections. You can have them do that on a blog. You can have them do that on exit tickets. You can have them do that in so many ways. And all of that information is feeding into your understanding of those kids. And I just feel like that is so, I mean, I think most educators understand that, but if you can have multiple pathways into understanding the kids, and a lot of times a kid will give you information and sometimes it's so subtle and you just have to kind of, but you know, multiple opportunities to reflect in many different ways can be a fantastic avenue to understanding who your kids are all about. And, you know, one of the things that drives me crazy about teaching middle school or, you know, that's a little vexatious is you'll be working with a kid, and then 2 or 3 months into the year, you'll talk with the parent, and the parent will say, "Oh, do you know that this, my child is so good at this?" And you'll be like, "I had no idea."
Yeah.
Right. And then how can you build that into the curriculum or into the activities? And so when that can be a point of engagement with the student. And that's why that communication with the family can be so important.
Yeah.
So I do want to just look at this third point that we have in part 2, where we talk about building relationships with all of our students through some structures. And I guess I want to start with Meg. We're looking at advisory and developing curriculum with students and PLPs. And Meg, as someone who is working with a new team, how have you been working in those structures, and what does your advisory look like and your PLP process, and how is that happening in a new way with a new team?
For the first part, advisory. So we don't necessarily have advisory, but we do have a prime group. And so I would say that probably mimics most of the structure of an advisory. We do some team building activities within it. We build towers out of paper or whatever the time is. And something that's been interesting about being on a new team is realizing when we put that advisory in our schedule is allowing us to tap into that advisory a little bit more as an advisory. I think before it was like right out of the gates at the start of the day, and kids were tired, or it was 15 minutes one day and 20 another. And so we've revamped our schedule the third week into school and said, this isn't working. Like we need, and thankfully we have the flexibility to do that. So I think having some opportunity for kids to, we've been taking walks as a whole team, and that's been a really nice opportunity to just, again, get to know each other, walk around the track, get some fresh air, have a brain break. And it goes a long way. And kids have, now that we have a system in place where kids are saying, hey, can we do this activity here? Can we have time for this here? So they're doing some self-advocacy. And I'll jump to PLPs just really quick, because we're just in conversations about, we had bundled into Protean a little bit last year, and that didn't work out so great. So we're just having conversations now as a level around what does, without putting the cart before the horse, what the container looks like. So we are really wanting to get a group of a think tank of 7th and 8th graders to help advise us on what is that going to look like? What do you want it to look like? How, it doesn't have to be all the same container, but what do you want something that looks like a personalized process to be? So that just came out of Tuesday's faculty meeting this week. So I'm excited about really letting student voice help to establish what that is, given some of the parameters that were given. And then Wendy and I are teaching humanities so we're on a 4-person team. There's a science and math teacher, and then Wendy and I are humanities. And so right now we're just talking about like, what is humanities? Because for most of the kids, they haven't had a class called humanities. So Wendy's been doing this sort of 10,000 foot making claims and visuals to support what humanities is. And I've been sort of boots on the ground. Where are we? What's our town? Where do we come from? What does it mean when we say we're from this area? And the kids are giving us some direction on what they're interested in around the town, what they're curious about, whose voices are being heard, whose voices aren't being heard, or whose voices aren't reflected in a map or a photograph or whatever our artifacts are. And I think those two lenses are, and now Wendy's working on stories. So those two ideas are leading into, we're going to go to the self and world process. So we're going to start with self and world questions the Bean model of negotiated curriculum with our students. And again, we have an opportunity. Apologies.
We'll be leaving at 4 o'clock. Make sure you come and pick up the list from me before you go on the bus.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So because we have kids coming from different teams, we don't want their 7th and 8th grade experience to be a repeat of curriculum, and humanities affords us that flexibility. So, so I'm excited to see what the self and world question curriculum process will yield. I'm excited about that.
I mean, that sounds great. I have a bunch of follow-ups, but Kevin, do you want to talk to us about some of the structures? You've already talked about conferences and communications with the families, but what about advisory, and where are you in the PLP process right now? And I think this is this part of the conversation is probably gonna lead into our discussion of practice and what this looks like in each of our classrooms. But before we really get to sort of the, what we're doing now, Meg started that conversation. I'd just like to back up and hear from Kevin. What are some of those structures that you have in place, maybe team-wide or school-wide, around advisory, curriculum, et cetera? What does that look, how's that taking shape this year?
Yeah, so team-wide, we've always had morning meeting time, which is each core works as an advisory. That meets 3 times a week for about a half hour. And within that time, we do a lot of our getting to know you activities in the beginning of the school year, getting our 5th graders really involved and hearing them. Our 6th or 8th graders already know it's a very safe place and safe community with your core. So that's where we do a lot of the fun team building things. One thing I've been trying to do more of is the Circle of Power and Respect, which came up at MGI this past summer. And, even as simple as just having kids being able to bring in a talking piece and they talk about, why it's important to them. And then we just do a really simple, basic prompt. We pass around just so I can ensure that every single week, every single kid's voice is heard in the circle. Because I was noticing last year that we would go, a couple morning meetings and be like, oh my God, I never, outside of the person saying good morning to the person next to them, that couple students never participated in anything else. And that wasn't okay with me. So I really want to have students have an opportunity to have their voices be heard at least once a week. So that kind of opened up that a little bit for us. It's a formal process for us and something that I think the kids are taking seriously and they've been liking quite a bit. Outside of that, the other things that we do structurally in the beginning of the year, we don't really start anything academic until week 2. We do a ton of just team building, team activities where we're taking kids outside, we're playing games. The 2nd week of school, we take kids on a camp out and it's all student led. So our 8th graders are campsite leaders and they draft their campsite. So we'll have 7 boys sites, 7 girls sites. Each one has about 6 to 7 kids. And each 8th grader has their mentor. They'll have their administration with them and then they all be in their campsite group. And then again, they go out to Grand Isle, have a ton of team building activities, they have a ton of downtime. We do some formal stuff together. And then it just makes everybody feel like they're part of the team there. So that's kind of our first couple weeks of school that we work on. One thing, and Meg, you were talking about how you're getting student voice on curriculum. That was making me think of something I want to do more with. And I've been reading Sam Nelson's blog posts about how he's doing some negotiated curriculum pieces and now hearing about you using that think tank. One thing that we're trying to do more of with getting student voice, again, having kids feel that sense of belonging, is through our sustainability program. Sorry. And that's been completely student-led in terms of them figuring out what they're interested in and starting out with. And that's all been linked into some of our PLP model this year too, with their citizenship goals. And Don, I took that from you. I know we've been talking about the badging and micro-credentialing and how is that supporting some of their citizenship work. So we have a lot of these pieces moving around right now that feel a little new to us. But again, I think we're in a point where our structures year to year and having a multi-year team, we're able to tweak certain things and see where it goes. So I'll hopefully have an update in the next meeting to see how that's going.
Thank you for that. I think there's just a ton happening right there. And I want to move into our practice and how we're starting to, what does this look like in the classroom? I know, Meg, you talked about it a little bit. And I just want to maybe hit on some ideas that Kevin mentioned. And then we can all take turns talking about what that looks like. So one of the things that's happening in our classroom, Meg, is that we're doing a Voices of Montpelier, where we're using the Young Writers Project as a community journalism project. So if you type in YWP community journalism, they have a whole website that has talks about journalism and also has some challenges for young writers. And I'll be honest with you, is the rollout for me has been incredibly clunky. And so just back up a step, out of the Middle Grades Institute, and Meg, you should join this project. Out of the Middle Grades Institute, I'm collaborating with Joe Rivers at Brattleboro, Kyle Chadbourne at Orleans, and Jeremy Demink at Tuttle Middle School, I think, in Burlington. And we're going to collaborate with you now too, Meg. And what we're doing is we started out with this idea of how does community impact our sense of, how does community and place impact our sense of identity?
Oh my God, that's our question.
I know. Well,
awesome.
But here's the thing is, though, I rolled it out like clunkily. Like usually I start with a biography, and I think that maybe I should have done the biography first. So I was like muddling around and trying to figure out what to do. And then what we did is we did asset mapping of Montpelier and of Vermont. And then we also did relationship webs, which is sort of a typical thing. And we identified the assets and principles and values in our relationships. And then we looked at whether or not those principles and values and assets are reflected in our community and reflected in the state of Vermont. And we also went to the Montpelier website, and they have a statement about what their hopes are, their aspirations are for the community. And we looked at that and we read whether or not we felt the principles and values were seeing the connection between the town and the school. And then I was like, what do I do next? Right. And so I decided Jeremy Demink had this great idea about using children's books to look at how place and community can shape identity. And so we read 5 children's books, which I actually have right here.
Awesome.
So we read, just let me show you this. Sorry. We read Each Kindness by Jacqueline Woodson. Yes. And we looked at the principles and values of that school. We read, this is an outstanding, I love this book. It's called Freedom in Congo Square. We read this and we looked at how place shaped, the identity. We looked at Canoe Days by Gary Paulson. Mm-hmm. And then our last 2 were Last Stop on Market Street, which is this one right here. Yep. And I want to talk more about this in just a second. And then we also, this is a fantastic book. I love this book. This is called Dreamgirl, and it's a true story about the first female drummer to come off the island of Cuba. And she ended up being part of an all-girl band. It's fantastic, and the art is tremendous. But what we did is we had the kids look at those books and see how the principles and values, or maybe even the traditions of the community, were either supporting the identity or in sometimes hindering the identity or having an influence on relationships. So we looked at those, we had these discussions, and then kids wrote a paragraph about how they feel place, community, and identity are sort of mixed together. One thing, I tried to be, so when we're talking about equity, I tried to make sure that we had a wide range of authors and a wide range of people reflected in the reading. But what we didn't do, and what I really want to get back to, is this voices of dominance and marginalization, which I think you brought up, which is really, I think that's very interesting. But it's also this idea of what is the curriculum that I'm teaching, and is this reflective, can my students see themselves in that curriculum, right? Yeah. So that's where we are in terms of the community place. And then what's happening is that we're going to interview Joe Rivers in Brattleboro is having his kids interview people in the community, and they're going to be asking how the community has impacted their lives. And I think the idea is eventually we're going to have kids interviewing each other and talking about the community and how it's impacted them. And then we're going to try and have those uploaded somewhere so that kids from across the state can be hearing about how the different places in Vermont shape their identities.
That's so powerful.
Well, it's new, and for educators out there, you know, it's when you're clunking through this stuff, you know, it doesn't feel. It's always like we'll get it right the second time.
I know.
But so anyway, so that's what they're doing. That's what I'm trying to work through, and we're trying to figure out how, you know, where we're living, how that impacts us, right? And then I'm also trying to tie that to relationships. But first of all, I want to mention Kyle Chadbourne at the Orleans school. He and his teaching partner, Andrea Grattan, are doing book groups based on identity. And we'll be posting that information to the PLP Pathways website. And we'll also be tweeting that out because he's having kids read books about identity and have his students are making connections to the characters. So I think that's really important. And then the other thing that I want to point out that I was mentioning to Kevin before, and I apologize if this is a lot, but this book, Last Stop on Market Street, is also part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals reading clubs. I have just discovered that the UN SDGs have books that are partnered with each of the goals. So this book right here, The Last Stop on Market Street, is partnered with goal number 1, which is no poverty. And so you can be sort of doing the literary analysis. You can have kids reflecting and thinking and making connections. But the idea that you had about showing them maps and photographs and asking who's represented and who's not, I think is really important. And then the last thing I want to say is that teaching tolerance, Life Lagueros, who's at the Tarrant Institute, I talked to him and asked him if he has, you know, good resources. And he sent me an email and some material I think that were really important, where he talked about we need to move beyond our personal identities and look more at social identities and look at some of the experiences of people who have those different identities. Now, again, I'm just learning and working through this stuff and trying to get better at it. But he has some excellent resources, and Teaching Tolerance has a whole unit on build the hidden identities. And so what I'm going to do is, before I write our biographies with my students for their PLPs, we're going to be looking at these hidden identities, which are around gender and, you know, some of those identities that we don't always talk about in school, but that are such a, you know, gender and race that are such a critical part of who we are. And Teaching Tolerance, again, has a really good resource, which I'll link also to PLP Pathways, about sort of these social, these hidden identities and how powerful they are with kids. And so that's something that I'm adding new this year, and I'm trying not to blunder through it and trying to come up with a cohesive final piece. But this will all go on to the identity page of their PLPs.
That sounds fantastic. That sounds really cool.
It sounds good in practice,
No,
in theory. What about you? And I apologize for rambling there, but what are you folks doing in terms of in the classroom, how you're working through identity and how that's going to be ending up on their personal learning plan or in their goals?
I was realizing that as I was sharing some of that information before about, you know, we're going to do the self and world process and the story of Shelburne right now. But the thing that I'm taking an equity course through our district called Cultivating Equity, and realizing how, and I'm so grateful to have a teaching partner that I can bounce some ideas off of, because it's that equity piece. It's the language that I use. It's in the resources that I'm sharing with kids, where I continue to, I need that, Rebecca Haslam calls that accountability. You know, like I want somebody else to just say, hey, like there was some resource that I gave kids around understanding a little bit more about Shelburne Farms. And in it was this reflection about owning artifacts or owning objects, and how does that tell a story of who you are. And Wendy thankfully was like, I wonder if we could change that word own to, and so we changed the language because of just being mindful that many kids, students, that they don't own much, or their families might not. And so that idea that I'm constantly learning so much more about how are the tasks that I'm asking kids inclusive, equitable, what language am I using that might that just might enhance a stereotype as opposed to dilute it. And this book that I'm reading for this course called Blind Spot is really powerful. And I'm going to link there's a webinar with the Bergman Leadership Group that talks about this particular book. And it's just fascinating to listen to it. And it's about diluting in what ways can we dilute those stereotypes. So when we're talking about identity, when we're providing kids with resources, dispelling the stereotypes and the bias that's inevitable in our language. So that's what I'm trying to be mindful about.
And I'm in that group too.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
And it's like, I'm hearing you say that, and my coworker Amanda's in it. And again, it's the same thing. It's just so important to have that other person, just have teammates to be able to bounce ideas off of, because it is such important work. And I'm so glad that it's so just present right now and across our state, and people are really thinking about it and considering it and being reflective, and not being insulted by people saying like, oh, you should really think about this more, or change how you're doing things, but being like, yeah, like, let's take a step back and think about how is the language I'm using? How is that, affecting others, and what's the impact of what I'm doing, or the different resources I'm using? What's the impact that has on kids? So that's been really powerful. And just stemming off of what you've been saying, we're doing very similar things in our small lit groups. I just finished teaching Ghost Boys. We're wrapping it up right now, which has been an amazing experience. Just getting, again, it's a 5th through 8th grade small groups that we have. I did Ghost Boys, and we had a smattering of other books that were offered. I was like, wow, like these 5th through 8th graders are having some really mature conversations about bias and their own biases, and what they're seeing as what's equitable and what's not equitable. And because I was really nervous coming into the school year, like jumping into this book saying like, all right, let's try to do this. But I was like, yeah, they're ready for the conversation, and it's an important conversation to have. Like, it's so important. So we decided as a team later in the school year that we're going to have as one of our lit books themes is just going to be on equity. So each one of us are going to have, a book like Ghost Boys or March or something along those lines that have and we're hoping to get copies of oh gosh, what's the name of the Benefits of Being an Octopus?
Oh yeah, yep. And Braden.
So just to get like a huge, just a plethora of different books that really ground themselves in equity. And so our whole team is having that conversation, because in those smaller lit books where we have just 10 to 15 kids, you can really get in deep and do like things like the identity wheel, and it feels more intimate, which I think is so important when you're going over some of these topics with middle school kids. Outside of that, hearing you both talking about some of the stuff you're doing with humanities, my other colleague Debbie and I, who we both teach social studies, I do 5-6 and she does 7-8. We're committing like the whole first half of the year to one of Jeremy Demink's ideas around youth activism and social activism. And our theme is around, what does it mean to be marginalized? And we're linking that into some geography concepts. And again, that idea came from just meeting with Jeremy at MGI, and he was sharing his resources, which he pretty much has like an entire curriculum developed. He's like, yeah, here, go for it. Like, here's all the things you need. And we looked at it and I've been unpacking that and tweaking it to fit what we're doing on our team. But it's been incredible. And again, some of the things that the students are getting into and the questions they're asking and the conversations they're having, even again, with the 5th and 6th graders that I have in social studies, I'm like, this is like, why haven't we been doing this? I'm kicking myself that like it's taken this long to, you know, when we're doing a Peace One Day unit, of course, it's important to be looking at, you know, Gandhi and MLK, but we have all these youth activists that are in our, you know, that are so relatable to these kids right now that I'd never heard of before. And it's like, you know, Greta Thunberg, who's all over the news right now, and Recap, like why is it taking me so long to get behind some of this work? So I'm glad that we're doing it now, but yeah, that's been my own personal reflection, is being frustrated with myself that it's taken this long, but I can see the value of it for sure.
It's all good. It's all good.
I just want to mention now, I don't know if this is the right time to do it, but one of the resources that we've talked about is Jeannie Phillips has developed for the Middle Grades Institute a document, and I'll post this on PLP Pathways, but it's equity literacy and the middle grades competencies. And she has all these questions and actions to take regarding, and it's the middle school competencies, and they're dovetailed with the Gorski equity literacy framework. So for example, one question might be, what will I say when I hear or see bias in my classroom? And then how might I develop student skills to recognize and respond to bias and inequity in the classroom? And what Kevin was just saying about this idea of activism, I think right now, you know, I'm looking at sustainability and climate change pretty deeply, but there are huge equity issues involved with that. And so as a skill, how do you start teaching kids to recognize those biases and those inequities so that they can then become those activists, right? And I think what's important, I mean, at least for me, is that we scaffold that learning so that kids can repeat that over time, and that they can do that on their own, right? So you guide them through, okay, you've realized this inequity or you've realized this bias. And so what's the process in order to address that or redress that? And can we be scaffolding that process for kids so that they can repeat it on their own when they see that bias, when they're either at their next life and learning stage or when they're an adult, right? Like, how is that a civic, an opportunity to teach civics and to teach empowerment and agency and that activism? And so I think that is something that I'm, you know, the wheels are turning in my head. Like, how do you teach kids to see that bias? Right. And I just think that, I don't know. I just think that's really important, and something I don't have that developed, but I certainly would be interested in developing that. And Kevin, I think it sounds like you're sort of on your way to doing that. And, you know, these are resources I think that this organization is designed to share, so that if we can be putting these out there, and if we can get, you know, I'll talk to Jeremy, because some of his stuff, his stuff is outstanding. And so if we can be helping teachers to understand the structures and the processes that they can incorporate into their own classrooms. And I just kind of want to tie this back to that, you know, do we think about students and their identity as activists, right? So is that something we should be asking kids when we're talking to them about their identity? You know, are you a scholar? Are you you know, this? Are you that? Are you an activist? And what does that mean? And if you're not, what would you be an activist about? And that's also that would be a great way to hear more about their interests and what they find to be important. And it also leads down this pathway of how do you communicate that to other people effectively? It leads really to the transferable skills, right? So, that sounds like what you're doing is awesome there, Kevin.
It's great.
So we're about out of time. Does anybody have any last comments or thoughts or things that they want to share before we sign off? Any events that are happening? We mentioned a ton of resources tonight that we'll post on PLP Pathways. Does anybody have any events that are coming up that they are excited about or want to share?
Yeah, we're taking our students, a handful of our students, to the Cultivating Pathways to Sustainability event at Chadbourne Farms, and really pumped. We've been asked to be the keynote, so our students get to be the keynote at the event, which is quite the honor. So I'm really excited to have our kiddos go out there and share some of the work that they've been doing and their hopes for the future on future projects too. So that'll be an awesome event.
Meg?
Fantastic. So there's the Equity Summit that's up at JP. And I'm trying to find it. It's a VPA Equity Summit on October 8th. And it's a, yeah, can you hear me? Oh, sorry.
Yep.
And so anyway, it's I'm attending it, and we're hoping to get some other students to get some students and other teachers possibly there as well. So I'm looking forward to that.
Okay, so that's on October 8th, I think you said. Also on October 16th, VHEC is presenting From Equity Awareness to Equity Action, Instituting Educational Justice in Vermont Schools and Communities. And then also on November 1st, there's the Youth Environmental Summit. So it's an annual conference of middle and high school students to learn about environmental issues. And I think that ties into the activism piece that we just mentioned. In closing here, I just want to also mention for viewers, we're missing two of our key contributors, Maura Weiler and Lindsay Hallman. They're out and about, working hard. They'll be joining us at our next webinar, which is October 17th. And our next webinar, we're really going to focus on setting goals and the evidence that kids are providing to demonstrate their mastery and their proficiency. I do just want to remind people that you can watch our webinar on YouTube. We're using a new platform this year, Zoom. And so what's going to happen is we'll have the webinar posted on YouTube, and we'll also send out the opportunity to earn some professional development hours if you are, you can get certified after watching the webinar. And that'll be true across all 9 of our webinars. And again, our next webinar is October 17th. You can visit our new website, PLP Pathways. We're also on Twitter, and we're on YouTube. And as I mentioned previously, we have lots of great videos that are short related to Act 77, identity, relationships, proficiency-based learning, and flexible pathways. This is our first episode of our 5th season, believe it or not. And I just want to thank everybody for joining. And again, you guys are doing great work. I really appreciate it. It's not always easy to get this stuff done, but talking to you is really motivating, and I appreciate it. And I'll let you guys, if you have any last words, take it away.
No, thanks. I'm looking forward to hearing more about what you're doing and collaborating. So I can't wait.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the late September. And we'll see you soon. Thanks again, everybody. Take care.
Thanks. Bye, Don.